All right. Good evening, good evening, good evening, everyone, and thank you for joining us once again for the fourth installment of our ongoing series of community conversations around the topics of equity, racism, and the need for racial healing. If you've watched the conversations in the past, you know they've always been very open and honest, and there's been a lot of good that come out of them. So I am interested to hear from our honored guests here today as we address a very important topic. Tonight's conversation is focused on the mental well-being of our students, the impact of what many are referring to as a dual pandemic, and ways we can also safeguard and support our youth. And that's why we are here each and every time to continue this important dialogue. And now I do want to introduce our guest panelists here today so we can get started. I'm going to go here to my right. We have Dr. Tynesa Giles. She's with the School Social Work here at CCPS. Thank you so much. We have Dr. Connie Hansinger. She's a trauma education specialist as well as CCPS. And over here on my left, we have Dr. Fantasy Lozado, Assistant Professor Developmental Psychology over at VCU. And then we have Dr. Anthony McLaurin, Principal at GW Carver Middle School. All right, thank you guys again for joining us here this evening. Just a couple of days ago, World Mental Health Day was observed on Saturday, October the 10th. And practitioners and school leaders, as you all know, have a very clear understanding of the essential role that mental health currently plays within our school systems, as well as the development and well-being of our kids. So what we're going to try to dive into today is how do you bring awareness to those who maybe have never had a conversation about it in the past, or who are unsure of how to openly discuss this matter. You know, sometimes there's a negative stigma attached to mental health and getting the help that you need in having that conversation. So the questions are all assigned. If you've joined before in our conversations, you know that's how we kind of handle things. But if at any point anyone wants to piggyback off of someone else's point, or you guys want to add to it, please feel free. I love to just kind of go back and forth. And if I ask some other follow-up questions, feel free to just dive in. I'm going to look forward to the conversation. We're going to start with Dr. Connie Hansinger. Well, Connie, adverse childhood experiences greatly impact students, individuals from all walks of life. So can you please speak to the long-term effects of adverse childhood experiences and how that may impact students academically and socially, but also how this really impacts a person's resilience and response to these life stressors. We're going to start there. I got one more part to that question, but let's try to attack those first too, if you don't mind.
Okay. It might be good to just kind of briefly review adverse childhood experiences.
Yes,
and, you know, this was a study that was originally done in the 90s by a couple of researchers that were really looking into the connection between adversity in childhood and later health outcomes. And previously, you know, certain aspects of childhood dysfunction or abuse had been studied individually, but this really looked at it collectively as a whole, as like a public health concern. So what they found was some common experiences, and really they looked at 10 of the most common, and they fell into the categories of abuse, neglect, and household dysfunction. And what they found was that it was incredibly common, actually. You know, 2/3 of the population had at least one exposure to adversity in childhood. And when they looked at exposure, that really meant like, what was your exposure to basically toxic stress or a stress dose in childhood before the age of 18? So if, for example, you had experienced abuse, that would be one ACE, one adversity. If you had experienced abuse and someone in your home had a mental health condition, that was 2. So that really was what they looked at as far as an ACE score. So it was really your level of exposure to that toxic stress. And what they found was, as the level of exposure to those toxic stressors went up, so did your likelihood of potentially experiencing poor health outcomes later in life. Substance abuse, domestic violence, some of those kinds of concerns. So knowing that it really talks about toxic stress and how that impacts the brain, and we know that for children who've experienced a lot of toxic stress exposure, that they spend a great deal of time in the fight, flight, or freeze part of their brain, which means that they're having sort of an overexposure to this stress. And when you're in survival mode, you're not in the higher level cognitive functions like learning and regulation and behavior and memory. So that makes it really difficult for kids who've had those long-term experiences. And you know, when you look at stress exposure in the body, we're really only designed to have that for about 20 minutes. And so for kids who continuously live in these conditions, they're spending a lot of time in these lower parts of their brain, and that does certainly impact academics, social emotional skills, behavior, and learning. So we know that they need skills, you know, to help them understand how to regulate some of this when stress rises. We know we need positive environments. So there are a lot of strategies and skills that we've looked at in schools that we know can help not only kids who've experienced trauma, but all kids. These are best practices really for all kids.
So essentially what I'm hearing is kind of like, and I come from a space where I'm not too familiar, so I love to ask follow-up questions like this because there are a lot of people that may not be, you know, in depth with some of the work you guys do. So essentially what I'm hearing is their brains, particularly young children, it's not developed or it's not in a stage where it's meant to handle that kind of trauma. Is that what I mean?
Right,
You see that?
right.
So now let's go. So when we do hear of trauma, we often think of one major occurrence. However, it can stem from a lot of different circumstances and experiences. Dr. Hunsinger, what support is provided to the schools in an effort to not only identify, but also...
Oh,
Sorry about that. My microphone was off. So let's go back to, we talk about the trauma as people think it's like maybe one major occurrence, but what support is provided within the school system to offer support for these kids, but not only identify, but make sure they're wrapping as many resources as possible around these children? And Dr. Giles, I'd love for you to jump in, as I would hope you can speak to the support as well from school social workers for our students.
you want me to go first?
Yeah,
So
go ahead,
I
yeah.
would just say that, you know, as a school system, we really subscribe to sort of a multi-tiered systems approach. So we know there are universal practices that are great for all kids that particularly support some of our students who've experienced trauma, maybe have difficulties with regulation or behavior. Some basic things that we do, we know that work with all kids are predictability, routine, and structure, positive climates with a lot of positive praise, really clear expectations, teaching kids the skills they need as opposed to, you know, really being more reactive and punishment focused. So we really look to build those skills on the front end. We know that despite a lot of those good universal practices, sometimes we have kids that still struggle. So then they may go up in tiers and we provide additional supports, like maybe there's individual or group counseling with a school counselor or working with a social worker. And then sometimes there may be some kids who have even more significant concerns, and we have mental health support specialists. We have crisis intervention. We have good relationships with Chesterfield Mental Health and some of those wraparound supports. So we really kind of have that tiered approach.
And just to piggyback what Connie said, our department, which is comprised of 32 social workers, and out of the 32 social workers, we have 12 licensed clinical social workers, and we have 8 trauma specialists within our department that are equipped to handle the students that come in that might have some symptoms or some triggers or characteristics of trauma that might affect them learning in the virtual world as well as in a hybrid setting, because we do have some of our students that are back in a hybrid model. And what our department did this summer is we went through a rigorous training to refresh and make ourselves aware of just being culturally relevant, being culturally competent, so we can be responsive to the needs of our minority students. And so in doing that, we have incorporated more social emotional learning approaches to handle our students who might have some concerns with mental health or just having anxiety or depressive symptoms that being in the pandemic as well as being in a virtual setting might not match their needs at that particular time. And so what our department has done is within the virtual module that they're using, we've created canvases so that we can have group sessions and individual sessions with students who might have some difficulty or challenges within the classroom. And our social work staff that also works with our school psychologists and counselors, and we work together to come up with mindfulness techniques and training. And we also do trauma-informed care approaches to our students. And another thing that we're doing is engaging ourselves in student support meetings to where we're looking at all of our students in a multi-tiered system, and all the social workers are in that tiered model, from the universal model, which is the bottom level, the first level, to the second level, which is more of an approach to look at the 10 to about 20% of our students who might need a little support, and then the top level, which is the top 3% that could be really struggling in the classroom. And so what we try to do as a department, in working with counselors and our psychologists, because we really work together, we're interwoven like a nice blanket, as you might say, is really incorporate our support services that we have been trained to do in a clinical perspective, so that we can reach not only the students but the families and the community, because we realize it's a community approach that we have to look at. We also look at the essential needs that might be impacting our students in the learning environment, and so we really try to engage and teach teachers and administrators and give them support as well with any complications they might see that's arising within their buildings.
And I just want to follow up a little bit, if you guys don't mind. Um, we're in a pandemic. I would imagine for some of these families, some parents may be going through some financial struggles because there might be job loss in the home, or dealing with maybe possibly contracting the virus in itself. What are some of the things that you are seeing? Maybe you can speak to trends, but maybe not specific circumstances. But what are some of the things you're seeing with our students here at CCPS at home? Because that's an interesting piece that I didn't really think about, is that they're at home most of the time learning, and that's where the trauma is potentially happening. What are you guys kind of seeing with that?
Well, I know that as a community, and I'm part of the Trauma-Informed Community Network, one of the things we've talked about is the increased incidence of domestic violence and abuse.
Right.
And unfortunately right now, as our kids were at home, they weren't really in constant contact with the mandated reporters who, the schools do a lot of that. But we also know, the stressors on families, there's certain elements that almost compound trauma, this collective trauma that we're all experiencing now. Things like unpredictability. Nobody knows really what to expect next. Immobility makes it very hard too. We're spending a whole lot more time together with families, and some of those situations are healthy and some may not be. Numbing out, and really just kind of a loss of sense of safety when we're out of our routines. So I think our families have struggled with a lot of that, balancing, trying to figure out how to work and homeschool, and just plain fear of not really knowing what to expect next. That loss of connection, we aren't really getting to visit grandparents and friends, and, some of our natural support systems have really kind of been limited during this time.
And if anyone wants to jump in, you guys can jump in as well. Is this something that you can build up a resilience to? Can you coach your students and your kids to a point where they can build up a stamina, I guess, to help them kind of deal with this? Because virtual learning, even in itself, is not a typical school day, where they're not interacting with the typical teachers and their classmates like that. Is it possible to build up a resilience to this?
Oh, I think definitely. I mean, if I'm going to speak a little bit about resilience, I think it's very individual, though. Not everyone who's experienced trauma experiences it in the same way. It depends a lot on our coping resources and our support systems, I think the number one buffer in stressors is a caring adult, and maybe if that's not at home, that can be that caring adult at school. So that's certainly a resilience builder. And then, in Chesterfield, we talk about the 6 C's, and developing those resilient skills like competence and confidence and character. And so, we know what elements really contribute to that.
And Dr. Lozado, I'm just kind of rope you in here in this conversation because it's a nice little segue. So the title of our discussion today is a dual pandemic, and we're addressing that. But how is this impacting our students specifically when we talk about the long-term impacts and their trajectory moving forward?
All right, yeah, so long term, just thinking about, I love some of the things that you've been bringing up, Dr. Hossinger, and talking about sort of developmentally what the demands of the current times are with what is developmentally appropriate for children to handle, right? And so when we're thinking about trying to help children build resilience, or thinking about what's the impact of children right now, but then in the long term, we just have to understand that children are sort of building these skills and growing these skills like a muscle. And so the extent to which current experiences are going to have long-term impact, it really is going to matter the types of resources and supports that children have, because without without supports of a caring adult, whether that be a parent at home or someone in the school, there will just continue to be almost a feedback loop about, experiencing trauma or experiencing high levels of stress, and then feeling sort of these big feelings that students don't know what to do with, children don't know what to do with, feeling somewhat out of control, feeling overwhelmed, feeling vulnerable, and then not really having a support system that can help them work through those big feelings, understand or put names to the feelings that they're having, understanding how to cope with, control, regulate those emotions, understanding, how to make one feel safe. I like that you said, this aspect of not feeling safe. If there's nothing to help a child to engage in that process for themselves over a long period of time, it is going to result in dysregulation. I have a big feeling, I don't know what to do with it, and so I do anything that will try to make it stop. And sometimes that looks very maladaptive, sometimes that's some aspect of aggression, sometimes that's withdrawal. It goes within for a child, and it is at an individual level. So what it looks like long term for children isn't going to look the same for every child, and it is going to have some sort of detrimental impact behaviorally, what their success trajectory could look like in school, what their opportunities will look like later on, if they cannot build up resources internally and draw on resources that they have externally to build up socio-emotional type of coping skills.
And then your research that you do really focuses on social emotional development of Black and brown youth. I'll get this microphone thing at some point. I promise. So the research that you do really focuses on social emotional development of Black and brown youth, which is a very important topic. And now, with all the racial unrest that we're seeing across the country, what are some of the concerns you share about our students and their emotional state? And what can schools do to increase that support for our kids?
That's a great question, because children are being exposed to the racial unrest, the racial trauma that is center stage in this country right now, in a variety of ways, but mostly through the thing that they have to use for their learning experience right now, right? Which is the online platform, which is computers, which is their tablets. And some of the work that we have done has been specifically on children's exposure to racial discrimination, either themselves as the target or witnessing someone else experiencing that racial discrimination in an online space. And what is unique about the experience of that in an online space is that there tends to be a written record of that thing, or there tends to be a visual that they can engage with over and over again. They can click on a link over and over again, but it's in essence where your access to that racial traumatic thing doesn't stop. You can have continual access to that thing. And that's the nature of technology at this moment. When children are exposed to racial discrimination or racial trauma in this online space, it has long-term implications for academic outcomes. We've seen that experiences with online racial discrimination impacts academic motivation and achievement over time, over a 3-year period in one study that we've done. We saw that even positive connections that youth can have with one another in online, that the benefits of that for their socio-emotional being is disrupted when they experience this online racial discrimination. And so it's a big concern for me right now is the level of exposure that children are having to what's happening right now. It doesn't mean, I'm not saying that children shouldn't understand what's going on in this socio-political context right now. They absolutely should. But what we know that can help to buffer the effect of what seeing these images are like on children's development is for some caring adult or someone to talk with them explicitly about what they're seeing, how it makes them feel, and what they can do to cope with their internal feelings, but also are there ways that they can get involved that will help them feel better about sort of their place in this world, because the effects of this exposure to discrimination and this racial unrest right now is some questioning about what does this mean for who I am as a Black or brown individual? What does it mean about my place in the world? Do people really care about me and the people that I live with and the places that I come from? Do they devalue me? These are the questions that they're asking themselves when they see police brutality against Black men and women, when they see the rhetoric that is being put out by political candidates around certain groups of people. They are seeing the devaluation live and in living color for themselves and wondering, what does that mean for me? And without someone to talk to them about that, a teacher who might talk a little bit about the current sociopolitical context and ethnic racial identity, without that, a child is left to try to figure that out on their own, and they may not be developmentally capable to come to a conclusion that doesn't have them internalize that for themselves.
And just piggybacking on what you said, I think the key is to really providing students an opportunity to share their voice. They're seeing what's happening in our society, in our communities, and something that we did back in August before the students returned to school was providing an open forum for students to discuss how they were feeling, some of the things that they were seeing on the news and the things that they're seeing online, and just give them an opportunity to really unload, some of the emotions that they were feeling within them. And excellent conversation that we had, and students are aware. They know what's going on, and you'd be surprised as far as what they have to offer. Also providing them opportunities to, like you said, show what they can do or do things to try to change our current state. Something I was proud to participate in was a march fully put together by students. Back in July, I believe it was, the senior class over at Thomas Dale, came up and started a march, initiated the whole thing up and down Route 10. We were able to work with local fraternity Alpha Phi Alpha to have a voter registration drive as well. So utilizing the students, sometimes they'll surprise you with the things that they come up with to support ourselves, and lots of times we as adults can learn a lot from the kids.
And just to piggyback off of Dr. Lauren, something that our department has been doing also is having those conversations, courageous conversations with parents, and how to navigate those conversations and giving the platform for them to have an open dialogue about it. And for parents who are not aware of what's going on or want to educate themselves so they can have a more courageous conversation, and showing the students how to be empathetic to what's going on, to the needs, being able to be inclusive in the dialogue with everyone, and also just showing that the caring community we have in each of our schools, so that they feel comfortable being able to approach a principal or a teacher or a counselor or a social worker or a psychologist about what they're feeling right now, because it's reality at this point. And when we look at our students who are really in our impoverished communities, well, they're getting a tri-pandemic. You have poverty, you have the pandemic, and then you have systemic racism. And so we have to prepare those students to feel loved, to feel that they can trust the school community, because they realize there's so much turmoil in the outside community that's really impacting where they're living, and they see it on a global and a national level as well.
I'll just add a comment here too, that our focus at the end of last year, when this first started, and all throughout the summer when we provided professional development for teachers, we really focused on the need for that social emotional support, because we knew that the kids coming back to us were going to be struggling. And many of our families are. And so I think about, like Dan Siegel, a famous researcher, says, you have to be able to name it to tame it. And that's really what we talked about, was providing the opportunities for kids to speak. It's so wonderful that you did that, Anthony, with your community and with your kids. And that's what we encourage teachers to do every day, multiple times throughout their day in learning, is provide opportunities for check-ins. Because how I feel this morning might not be how I feel midday. It might not be how I am at the end of the day. And then talk about it like it looks like, all of us are really struggling a little bit. Let's implement a skill. Let's talk about, we use mindfulness techniques. We do movement. We have conversations with kids and open up that opportunity for kids to really connect and talk about it.
Does this conversation, and anyone can really just jump in, but does this conversation ever, when you have these conversations with these kids, and we're looking for parents in some instances to have a level of understanding about these difficult topics surrounding race? What if the parents do not have that understanding? And does that conversation then go from you to the child to where you may have to speak to a parent and address some of the issues? How are you combating potentially what may be happening at home on that topic specifically when it comes to race and how they want to express themselves? What if their parents aren't in line with where they may be thinking about going? How do you guys deal with that? Or any research, anything to kind of see address it at all?
Yeah, I think the key is just encouraging parents to have a listening ear, even if they don't agree, with some of the politics or politically with some of the things that their student may believe, or regardless of which news station they're watching, but to make sure that they're listening to their children, and just to remind them that ultimately our role as educators is to encourage students to think critically. And eventually, they'll come up with their own viewpoints and stances on issues, but just encouraging parents to have an open mind as far as situations and what's going on in society is concerned.
I really love that response, because it may absolutely be the case that parents and their students don't necessarily agree on what's happening. And also that it is very likely the case that parents are going to have difficulties talking about issues of race, because we as a society for a very long time have had difficulties talking about issues of race. So none of us are an expert in any particular type of way, but that if you come to the conversation, number one, to make space for that conversation is of the utmost importance. I think a lot of parents may feel discomfort and want to shy away from having a conversation, feeling like they don't know what to say, but research shows that when you do not talk about race, where you kind of take this colorblind approach, or a color mute approach is what it's sometimes called, and not specifically naming and talking about race or racism or differences in racial group experiences, that this has long-term impact for students' own racial attitudes later on. And so that if you're trying to raise a critically conscious child, or you're trying to raise a child who's a critical thinker, you just have to engage in the conversation, even if you are afraid that you might make some missteps there. It's important to have the conversation, because the child is absolutely thinking about it, and they will find out information about it someplace else. Parents want to be a part of the conversation. And then the other thing that I will just say about that is that you can always come back to the conversation again. Don't think that one conversation is what's going to do it for a child. It needs to be ongoing in the household, or in the parent-child relationship, because one conversation isn't as impactful as many conversations over time, as well as many opportunities for a child to practice talking about it, to practice their skills of talking about these difficult things and listening, and building up those skills is one thing that is important, not just for parents, but for students as well.
And Dr. McLaurin, you're over there at GW. You know what?
George Washington Carver.
You're at George Washington Carver, the principal over there, and just kind of speak specifically to your school, the climate of your building, what you're trying to implement there, and how you're basically overall trying to meet the needs of the students.
Excellent. Thank you for the question. George Washington Carver is in the southernmost part of Chesterfield, so we're way down there near Colonial Heights, Petersburg area. So very, very diverse school population, one of the few schools in Chesterfield County that has a majority minority population, so we're about 53% African American, and most of our feeder pattern schools are Title I. So a very, very diverse population. Some folks that are living well below the poverty line, some folks that are living in $500,000 houses, but that's the case in Chesterfield, but in an area of the county that does have a significant amount of trauma, and families that are facing difficulties. So also being a member of the trauma-informed network throughout Richmond, the trauma-informed approach is something that I hold near and dear to my heart. So just thinking about some of the things that we do at Carver, and it's been stated a few times that caring adult, really the research says that a caring adult really helps to combat trauma and bring down the impact of ACEs. So we believe in the village approach to raising children. So some of the things that we do are mentoring. Mentoring's a big deal for us. And even throughout the pandemic, once the schools were shut down, the students weren't able to attend in person. Some of our mentoring groups continued in a hybrid fashion. The Chesterfield chapter of Alpha Phi Alpha came in and helped out and held a mentoring program, which just really wrapped up. The closing ceremony was this past September, but some of the activities included yoga, mindfulness, reflection and writing reflection, and really helping students to think and to work through some of the things that they've been dealing with. PBIS, positive behavior interventions and supports, is another mechanism that we utilize, and encouraging students to make positive choices and rewarding students for positive choices instead of always being punitive. So we really kind of deal with the what happened, but dig a little bit deeper and find out why it happened. And our staff is equipped with the tools through professional development, through weekly Trauma-Informed Tuesdays, which is a communication that's sent out weekly to our staff on journal articles, different literature that they can read through to help them to identify trauma and to help them to help students cope with trauma. Something that I am very proud of is a calming space. We're the Carver Cougars, so everything relates back to pause. So our calming space is called the Pause Room, and that's something that we've worked with along with our school counseling team. So students that may be having a difficult time, maybe they brought in some baggage with them to school from home, and they may act out with a teacher or with an adult in the building, and instead of removing them from the entire school day through a suspension or in-school suspension, the school counseling team has helped them to identify when they're having a tough moment. Our staff, operates and staffs that room, and they give them 10 to 15 minutes to redirect themselves, think through, and get themselves back on target.
I'll just piggyback on that a little bit because I've been involved with Dr. McLaurin's school, and he's done an amazing job. And I think some of the really big work that we've done at that school and many other schools is really working to change the mindset, that old traditional mindset of misbehavior consequence, and really trying to look at behavior in terms of, what's creating stress, what's going on for that student, what's caused this elevation, and really looking at it in terms of if we see maladaptive behaviors or things that leave kids in vulnerable positions, it's because that's a learned way of coping. So we're trying to really look at that in terms of helping kids manage that, calm down, be able to have a conversation in a space when they're ready to have that conversation, and allow for some voice, voice and choice for students. I love the calming space. I think kids know that they have a space to go when they start to feel elevated, so it's really being very proactive instead of waiting for someone to really make poor choices or get escalated and then receive a consequence. I mean, that just leaves kids in a really vulnerable position. So I love a lot of the proactive approaches that I think we're implementing, but I think critical to that has been a change in mindset and look at behavior in a very different way. Instead of, what's wrong with that kid, but what's maybe happening for that kid right now, and we need to understand and really investigate that and help build skills and coping strategies.
And the funny thing, I'll just jump back in about the calming space, and Dr. Hansinger was instrumental in setting that up, but it really helps the teachers to understand as well. You'd be surprised how many times we walk past the calming space and there's a teacher sitting on the beanbag chair as well, and they're taking an opportunity to just decompress and regulate themselves. So it really builds a level of empathy throughout the building for teachers to understand that, hey, kids are human, sometimes they need a moment too.
Yeah, we have to take care of our adults, and that was a big initiative in the spring. Was we did self-care training for the entire county. We did self-care training with psychologists, social workers, and school counselors, and then they teamed up and provided it for each one of their schools, because we knew that if the adults aren't well, then it's going to be really hard to help our students be well. So that's been a big push for us too.
And just to piggyback off of what Connie said, one of my colleagues that I work with, what we did along with self-care is that we took social emotional learning and provided teachers with techniques, instructional techniques that they can use to kind of help guide students in understanding their coping skills and where they are emotionally and their feelings, and being able to understand what the feelings look like and how to communicate their feelings. And so we're working towards trying to brand that out a little bit further. We did with one high school, and we're hoping that that opportunity will be able to engage in more teachers learning different instructional techniques so they can engage in our students in the virtual and the hybrid model way, but they can also help students, even though they're virtual, to really reflect on what does their feeling look like, how does it feel, and we give picture cues just in case if they're not understanding of what it looks like, so they can point out what it is that they're feeling at that particular point in time, and then have that discussion about it.
I love the piece when you guys are talking about discipline. I'm not sure. Can you guys speak to any research or anything that you're aware of that may be out there that speaks to the correlation between the trauma, Black and brown youth, and the discipline that is often implemented on that specific population, to where are the outcomes better if we take this approach to where we're addressing the emotion instead of making it a punitive damage if a young child acts out in school? Is there anything you guys can speak to specifically to show that this works instead of simply punishing a student?
One thing that I could say to that, number one is, that we know that there are disproportionate rates of exclusionary discipline practices that are used with Black and brown youth, and this is for a variety of reasons. And so people then talk about ways in which this is a pipeline of, from trauma to prison pipeline, honestly, kind of skipping, talking about trauma and then school to prison pipeline, but thinking about that, the sort of the hurt and the stress and the trauma that youth are exposed to, it manifests in a particular type of way. Their behaviors are read in a particular type of way that they're admittedly is biased against. And then they are disproportionately experiencing this out-of-school suspension for longer periods of time, making it so that they miss more and more educational experience and educational time. But that when you what I'm really loving about all the techniques that are being mentioned here is that they are evidence-based techniques, and that when you allow a child to kind of slow the moment down in a sense, that they're having big feelings, strong emotions, and to kind of slow the moment down to be able to say, what is it that I'm feeling? Investigate it. Why do I feel this way? Why do I feel out of control with it? And then what can I do to channel this emotion in a particular type of way or to calm myself down? When you allow a child the opportunity to do that, it teaches them about their emotions, it teaches them about coping, and it has sort of these exponential effects on children being able to cope more effectively in the future. It has effects on their engagement in the space. It has effects on how safe they feel, just in general, how safe they feel with other adults. It really sort of builds up sort of a shield for them for things that can come to them down the road that may be stressful or that may be traumatic. It's just helping them to build up those skills. So when you do that instead of an immediate type of punishment, punishing is oftentimes used to make a behavior just stop immediately, to make a situation stop immediately, but it doesn't teach anything. It just makes it stop. And it sometimes is not even that effective at making it stop. Sometimes it just makes it escalate. So all of these types of approaches slows the moment down, teaches the student a skill, and then it also, most importantly, shows them that they are valued in the space. Because exclusionary discipline practices communicate to a child simply, you and what you're doing right now are not wanted here. And the more and more that happens and it gets into a cycle of exclusionary discipline, the more that a child feels that they are never meant to be in the space in the first place. And by taking a time to engage in these types of practices, you're doing some relationship building with these students. You are showing them that they're valued in the space and that they can be contributors to this space as well. So all of the individual practices are very much evidence-based.
And just to comment off of Dr. Lozado, I currently sit on the equity committee, and one of the subcommittees is looking at disciplinary practices. And so what we're doing is we're really fine-tuning and combing through the disciplinary matrices that's originally used throughout the division, and we're trying to make sure that we're using culturally relevant, I can't talk right now, approaches, and being culturally responsive to the needs of our students so that we can minimize the student to the prison pipeline. And so we make those recommendations, and then from the recommendations, we're really working hard to ensure that we're being equitable in our approach and we're being inclusive, but also understanding that with our minority and Black and brown populations, there are some approaches that might need to be taught or educated when students who some might perceive that are being combative or being insubordinate, and it could be just a cry for help. It could be their voice because they can't really understand their feeling or their emotions right now. And so instead of taking a disciplinary approach, a majority of the schools are taking a de-escalation approach to actually having conversations with students so they can kind of find out what happened, where can we help you, where we can support you. And then from there, we provide the wraparound services for our students. So that way we can understand, the traumatic experience that they're going through, but also help them go comb through their feelings and their emotions and give them that extra support and nurturing that they need.
I'll just piggyback on that too, because I think something that's really helped us push some of this forward and that understanding is really grounding, like you said, in best practices, but also in the science, in the neuroscience. Like when we understand brain states, and I understand which brain I'm talking to. Am I talking to an elevated emotional brain, or am I talking to a thinking brain? And it's really unfair to impose consequences to a kid who's already escalated and elevated, who's really not in a state to problem solve or change that behavior. So understanding what state they're in and understanding how to approach that in a calm manner as an adult is really critical. So the education piece has really been just as important for our adults to understand. When I see that probably triggers me to be elevated. How do I calm myself, take a breath, have some space, and not be reactive, to be more responsive and approach in a really calm manner and engage kids so they have an opportunity to de-escalate before any problem solving can take place. And, to not do that really leaves kids vulnerable to things like suspension and expulsion and being pushed out. And it does send the message that we don't care about you, and that's not the message we want to send to our kids.
And I can jump in more as a practitioner. Before coming over to George Washington Carver Middle School, I was the principal over at the Chesterfield Detention Home School, and most of my teaching career was in juvenile corrections at Bonaire and Hanover when it existed and so forth. So I've definitely seen both sides of the gate, so to speak. But many of the students who found themselves in the detention home or in some of the various juvenile correctional facilities in which I taught, the common theme was that they were frequently suspended. They were removed from that learning environment, and they were made to feel that as if they were not valued in that school setting. But they felt valued in the streets. And there are predators in the streets that are waiting for young people to exploit them and to take advantage of them in a plethora of ways. So this work is really life-changing and providing opportunities for students to engage with their own emotions and to grow through them while keeping them in a space where they're safe, protected, and have the opportunity to learn.
If you don't mind me asking, not getting too personal, you can get as personal as you want or not as personal, but what made you make the switch? Did you feel like you can head off some of that with the students before they even get to those juvenile detention centers by getting inside the classroom yourself?
Right. So I was actually a history teacher for 7 years in juvenile corrections, but frankly, my first administrative job was a dean of students over at Thomasdale, and I got tired of seeing students come back to jail. It was depressing to me to see students, you work so hard and the student earns a GED or, passes SOLs and you work and you work and you work. And then 2 or 3 months later, he's right back in there because he's going to the exact same environment in which, he got in trouble in the first place. In my mind, I could be more of an impact to help students stay out of, these situations. So that's why I made the switch to, be proactive and hopefully keep students out instead of working with them when they're already in there. So.
Lucky to have you, man. For sure. The stigma surrounding mental health. Just kind of, if you guys can all just kind of add some words to that topic in itself, just like talk about the stigma and how we overcome that, because what I'm hearing, and this is a learning experience, let me be very honest, this is a learning experience for me too, and just sitting here and hearing everything you guys are saying, it sounds like this is an uphill climb.
So I thought about that question earlier, and I was thinking, recently I watched the Fred Rogers movie, and, his one quote that I've always loved is that, anything that's human is mentionable, and anything that's mentionable is manageable. And we have to talk about it. We have to take it out of the closet. We have to talk about it. We have to make it okay to talk about our feelings. When we do that, they don't seem as overwhelming and scary. And I think for a lot of our youth, when we have big emotions and we haven't been modeled, kind of how to talk about those and how to manage them, that it seems overwhelming and scary. So just shut down. And so I think the best thing we can do is just continue to talk about it. If we can talk about it, we can manage it, and we can talk about how to manage it.
I think when it comes to the Black and brown community, the biggest barrier is trust. Trust, and when you look at historically about the Black and brown community, everything was in-house. We kept it at home. If you showed that you had some type of mental health concern, it was a sign of weakness. And a lot of our Black and brown communities would go to the faith-based community for counsel, not understanding that it couldn't necessarily provide them the mental health support that they adamantly so needed. And so to be able to promote mental health and seeking counseling, we have to look at our community leaders. We have to build the trust of the Black and brown community, and we have to use our faith-based community, because our Black and brown communities trust the faith-based community. That is a support system for them. And we have to make it known that it's okay to have support, to have help, to ask for help. A lot of times I feel that even with our immigrants that come in, there's a lot of trauma that they're dealing with in regards to political trauma, just coming over to a new location trauma, being able to navigate the world that they're living in. And so we have to be able to reach out to that community as well, so we can be supportive to their needs, because we understand that they're coming in with some barriers and some gaps. And so we have to build that trusting relationship. And a lot of that times it comes from in the schools, but also, again, being culturally relevant to their experiences and being able to understand their experiences. And a lot of times the Black and brown community want people that understand who they are and understand the unique concerns in the Black and brown community. And that's something consistently we have to do, and that we've been doing. We've been trying to narrow that slope, so that way people are more accepting of coming to us and letting us know they need help.
Yes, just to build off of what you just said, Dr. Giles, in terms of that trust, I think is so key and important for thinking about this stigma of seeking mental health service or help for Black and brown communities. And just as in building that trust, there also just needs to be more, and I think you mentioned this a little bit, more provision of culturally relevant services with regard to mental health to make it more accessible, because there is rightly so distrust there with regard to Black and brown communities and some of the service providers of mental health. And so if you can lean into, or if mental health service providers can lean into some of the more culturally relevant forms of where that service can be provided, that will break down a lot of walls. So certainly people seeking help through the church has been a long-standing practice for the Black community, right? And so more service providers working with churches to provide the specific types of additional services that would be, in addition to the counseling that they might receive at a church. Thinking about there's been some fantastic work from researchers who are looking at hair care spaces, for instance, as a place where mental health services can be given out. So whether that be in the barbershop or that be in the hair salon, there's a approach called psychotherapy, and you're really like talking it out while you're getting your hair done, because these are things that are actually reflective of the lived experiences of Black and brown folks. And when is a time to kind of like decompress and talk about what you're feeling and what's been going on and all the troubles when you're getting your hair done, right? These are very accessible places where we can meet the needs of Black and brown communities that we're not tapping into enough to break down the stigma with regard to mental health. Because I think sometimes there's this mistake that Black and brown folks don't want to seek mental health, or that they don't really talk about their feelings, or they don't want to talk about their issues or problems that they're having. They do. They just do it in some of these really intimate spaces. And this is why, trust is central to breaking down the stigma, is because there are places where this happens, and you have to kind of be invited into that space. And it's important that mental health practitioners or service providers really work with communities, definitely not, working kind of by themselves to try to figure it out, but to really talk to people in the community about where can I provide this service to people? Where can I support families and students in a way that is comfortable to them to help them work through some issues with regard to mental health?
I don't think I can top psychotherapy, so I'm gonna leave that one alone. But that's awesome to be aware of those resources, and hopefully, as we come across individuals that need that support, can point them in the right direction. Yes, ma'am.
Talk about conversations. Listen, I've been up since 2:30 this morning, so forgive me. But when we talk about culturally relevant conversations and establishing a space where there's a lot of trust involved with the person providing the therapy in that situation and allowing the student to speak freely, how important is it to have therapists or social workers that are reflective of specific communities? And even if it's that's part one, but then part two, how do you build upon that for someone who does not come from that specific background? How do you provide them with the tools to make sure they can create a safe space for those students?
Okay, I'll tap into that. And that's one thing that my department did over the summer, is that we aggressively took an approach to be more culturally relevant and be more culturally responsive with our coworkers who might not had a good understanding. They had an understanding, but now they have a better and meaningful understanding of what it is to be in the Black and brown communities. It's being a part of the community, and you don't necessarily have to live in the community to be a part. It's being seen, it's being engaging, it's knowing who's in the community, knowing the community in itself. Prime example, I'm not from Chesterfield. I'm a Jersey girl, I'm from Jersey. Ah, yes, Neptune. Okay, yes. And so coming to Chesterfield, I had to learn the community, and how I did that is I was in the community. I participate in volunteering activities. My children are part of the community. I'm part of the PTA. I make myself visible. And so when I've made myself visible in the schools, in the surrounding areas, in the communities, they got to know me. Yeah. They got to know who I am. Who is Miss Giles? Who is Dr. Giles? Or Dr. Ty or Miss Ty, depending on which side of the county you're on. But being visible, that builds trust. And then being able to build a relationship with the community leaders, so they can start spreading the word about how trusting you are and that you are a support system versus a hindrance. One thing, the stigma about social workers is, hey, we're going to do something or we're taking something away, more so than providing a support or a service. And so when you're someone of an opposite ethnic group coming into the community, they have to see that you care. They have to see that you're really invested in the community, and how are you going to be a part of that community. And so our department works really hard in the areas that we serve so that the community leaders and the community and the students and the families can see us. So that way we're building those trusting relationships, and we're continuing to grow in our professional development, not only about cultural responsive approaches and being culturally relevant, but having culturally relevant plans. Having culturally relevant opportunities for families to take advantage of, because that's important to families. It's definitely important to our Black and brown community, because you have to understand the experiences in order to understand who I am as a person.
Honestly, you said so much so beautifully. I don't have a whole lot to add to that, because I think what you said is just key. You have to be in the community. You have to be seen as a trusting individual. That's of the utmost importance, especially if you don't look like the community that you are trying to serve. They have to know that you care, and that it's not well, I live over in this side of town and I'm going to come over and just, be with you all to sort of impose whatever it is my agenda is. Like, you have to sit down at the table with people and know their stories, know what their concerns and what their issues are. You could be coming in trying to provide, some service or support to people in a way that is just completely just not consistent with how people in that community live or think or, engage with one another. So just being a part of that community, I think, is, as you said, Dr. Giles, just of the utmost importance. And then the cultural relevance of things. One point that I failed to make earlier that I wanted to go back to was that in these spaces where you're trying to, for instance, teach children about their emotions and how to cope and deal with their own feelings, it's also important to celebrate who they are in terms of their race and their ethnicity. And some of the research that we're doing in my own lab is looking at this combination of sort of racial socialization or messages about race, particularly about one having pride in who they are, their culture, their ethnic racial background, that being paired with emotion-related messaging that is supportive of understanding your emotions, expressing or encouraging emotion expression in a pro-social way. Those two types of things together have sort of the best type of outcomes for students overall with regard to their emotion regulation, their understanding of emotion, their academic engagement. So it's important to support someone emotionally, whether you're talking about a child or you're talking about an adult. It's also important to make sure that they feel seen with regard to who they are, particularly their cultural or their ethnic racial background. Both of those two things together is the most powerful combination.
Yes, and I think for leaders in particular, it's important to definitely cultivate, the staff and the community that you have. So oftentimes we don't realize that there's so many community members, parents, and so forth that want to be involved, regardless of, the color of their skin. Students are looking for loving, caring adults who are willing to listen to them. But it's important, for folks who may not look the same way as their student body, to, as Dr. Giles said, get into the churches, go to football games, basketball games, find those common places where students are being themselves, being with their families, and that shows that you're willing to take it to the next level and that you really do have a level of care and concern. Also important to really educate yourselves, particularly if you are not from some of those same communities. Christopher Emden, the Jawanza Kunjufus of literature that can really shed light on the experiences that folks are living and that our practitioners need to be aware of.
I'll just piggyback on that too, because since we're also talking about the topic of trauma, wherever your trauma stems from, there's some common experiences of loss. There's a loss of trust, there's a loss of boundaries, there's a loss of safety, whatever that trauma is. And so keeping that in mind, and some of the things that you all are talking about, providing voice and worth and not doing two, but providing that voice for the community. You know, Dr. Anda, I had an opportunity to work with him, who was one of the original ACE researchers, and he travels across the country teaching communities about the impact of adverse childhood experiences. And one of the things he continuously says is communities need to develop their own solutions, because all communities look a little bit different in what their needs are. And so it's not just coming in and, you know, implementing a solution. It's hearing the voices of the community. What are the concerns? You know, what are the needs? How can we provide those services in a way that they can access and need them? So I love that, because it really just kind of goes back to those basic tenets of trauma. You know, there's a lot of loss. So how do we create trust and safety and boundaries and allow for that voice to happen?
That's good. I believe we touched on this a little bit earlier, Dr. Lozado, but this other question here, we've all been, you know, dealing with the pandemic, and a lot of people are in the same place for 24 hours in a day. And like you mentioned earlier, a lot of our students are digesting a lot of this racial injustice on their social media platforms. If you can, just talk about the implications once again of that, and how it's impacting students.
Yes, I hinted at earlier, or I talked a little bit earlier about there being, you know, long-term implications for students in terms of some of their adjustment, some of their academic adjustment, of sort of an overexposure to sort of acts of discrimination and violence against Black and brown folks. But other things that also comes out of the literature with regard to impacts on students have to do with students learning a little bit about really the sociopolitical context of what's going on right now, and particularly when they're able to, as we talked about before, sort of unpack that, digest that with an adult or with someone who can help them make sense of the meaning of what's going on right now and the meaning of the moment, and providing them voice to do that. This really sort of grows for students their own sort of civic engagement and their own critical consciousness over a period of time for them as well. So there are these implications. There are a lot of negative implications of the current moment and what can happen for students in terms of their emotional well-being right now. But, you know, as we've said before, the provision of supports in the context of this can also grow children's understanding of race, grow children's understanding of socioeconomic status and of injustice. And that if we take this moment in time to provide students with the space of being able to work out how they feel about what's going on, but to talk about also what's going on, and to talk about that in terms of this moment and also historically, that this can also be a moment in which we can see children sort of rise to the occasion and trying to come up with solutions for what we can do next, or what they can do at their schools, what can be done in their communities. I mean, we can talk about sort of the negative impacts that this has on students, because we know that there are many, but I think we can also take a moment to think through what can come out of, like, what new can happen and what can students be the catalyst for with regard to change if they are provided with support, if they're provided with voice, like many of the things that it was just discussed by, I'm so sorry, Anthony, I was going to say Dr. McLaurin, that was discussed by Dr. McLaurin at George Washington Carver. Like, those types of opportunities in this current moment are going to be things that really help students to, instead of us really just talking about the negative outcomes of what's going on with students, that instead that there is growth, that there is resilience, that in spite of what they're seeing right now, in spite of the adversity that they are experiencing in their homes, that there's this opportunity for them as well. I didn't articulate that as well as I wanted to, but.
No, I'm with you. I'm with you. Sometimes I just have to sit back and take it all in, honestly. We have this question here from a parent that says, as a parent, what should I be telling my kids, and what are you telling yours? I think if we can all chime in on that, I think that's a really important question. I think a lot of parents that are watching are looking for next steps, like what can I do? How do I get involved?
Well, I know my years as a school counselor, even before this position, parents ask the question about a lot of different topics, right? And my response was always that it's really important to be honest and transparent with your kids. But give them the information they're asking for. Sometimes we go way too much. It really depends on the developmental level of the child, right? But if your children have questions, you should answer those questions honestly and be transparent. That's a trust between a parent and a child too. You know, we don't want our kids to be getting the information from other places that might not be accurate. So we want to open up, you know, and have those conversations. And sometimes we have to say, hey, you know, if you have questions about what you're seeing, or do you want to talk about what we've seen, you know, I'm here, and you know, I'll tell you whatever I know. Not to pretend we have all the answers, but just to be honest and transparent. And I think that provides, you know, a feeling of safety and trust, and somewhere I can always go to, you know, for answers.
I think with my two kids, their ages 11 and 8, so they're asking a lot of questions. They're seeing a lot on TV. They're seeing some things in social media, supervised, of course. And one thing that I do, just to piggyback with Dr. Hunt saying, I am very transparent, open, and honest. But a lot of the questions they're asking has to do with race. And well, I have friends that don't look like me, but they don't treat me that way. And so it's giving them an understanding that everyone is not going to treat you the same. And there are some good people that are going to treat you just who you are, and they love you for who you are. And there are going to be some people who are going to think different of you, not because they don't know you, because of what you represent. And so they have an understanding of who they are. They understand what they're about, where their culture comes from, and they're very understanding of other cultures because I make them aware of other cultures. So they have an understanding, and they can develop their own attitude in regards to how they want to treat other people. The way that I teach my children is having empathy and how you treat people and being caring versus looking at someone and not liking someone because of the color of their skin. It's getting to know who that person is and then coming up with your own perception of whether or not, if that's someone that's a friend, or is that someone that you could just be respectful and mindful of who they are, and then you continue to go on with your life and your daily schedule.
Thought she was gonna beat me. She beat me last time. All right. I would say give students your truth. My truth is gonna be different from everyone else's truth on this panel, just based on, you know, where we grew up, the way we look, our different life experiences. But tell them your truth, and just give them the answers to the questions that they may have. But particularly for those of us who may have experienced bias, be it racial, gender, what have you, be careful not to project your own trauma or history of trauma onto your children, because I may have experienced something doesn't mean that any of my 3 children have to experience that or I have to relive it through them. I think it's important for us to make children aware of the historical context of everything that's going on and what led us to this point. And then really important for us to challenge them to think critically about what we can do in our small little space, wherever it may be, to make things better.
And for me, I have a 1-year-old, so we're not necessarily really talking about what's going on currently, but because I study this, I study about the ways that parents talk to their children about experiences with regard to race. I kind of have 2 responses here. One response is that, as we've said before, just having the conversation is really important, and as you all have said here, having that conversation openly and honestly, admitting when you don't know the answer, but let's find out together, giving them historical context. When parents do these things, also, you know, kind of talking about what's going on right now, and talking about discrimination at an individual level, talking about systems and discrimination and bias in that particular way. When parents have those types of conversations, but then they also have conversations paired with talking about resilience and resistance of the heritage and the legacy of their ethnic or racial group that they've come from, talking about all of the accomplishments, for instance, of the Black community, in spite of these biases, discrimination, and challenges. Both of those types of messages together really yield a lot of positive outcomes for children with regard to how they feel about themselves, how they feel about other people, and their engagement with their community overall and more broadly. And then what I think about what I'm doing personally, or what I would do personally as if my child were older, one thing I try to be really open and clear and honest about is how what's going on makes me feel personally, how it makes me feel that I need to be protectful of my son, and what his experience will be like going out into this world as a Black man at some point. I just want to be really clear and open and honest with my child about how that makes me feel, how I want to prepare him to be the best person that he can be in this world given his circumstances that he is given, but that also he can sort of dream bigger than the circumstances that we are currently in right now. And that if we can have these open and honest conversations based in empathy, based in listening to one another, that it's not even just about what's happening right now, but we can hope for something better in the future. So that's what my hope would be.
That's good. What can I do if I need more information? Where can I get help within CCPS?
Well, there's a lot of helpers within CCPS, and I would say that, your first point of contact is often your school counselor, psychologist, social worker. They're in every school. Go to the teachers can refer you to those helpers. Our social workers particularly are very in touch with all of the community services like Chesterfield Mental Health. We have a great partnership with them. If it's an adult within the system, we have an employee assistance program, that has great services for not only the adult that works with CCPS, but your family members. And so, we're in contact with Chesterfield Crisis. So there are a lot of great resources that you can just even, be in touch with in your local school. Tanisha, probably as a social worker, they're on top of a lot of stuff going on in the community.
I feel like I'm on the spot. Well, as a department, we have a Twitter page. And I know this is like a shameless plug, but at SSW_CCPS, where we continuously provide resources and information for parents or anybody in the community that would like to engage in what we put out there. We also have an internal webpage for principals that actually outlines all the essential needs and support services that are out in the community, whether it's food, shelter, whether it's mental health, whether it's just support and just understanding where they are at that particular time. We do have that available, and of course we make ourselves available for families as well, anyone who's in need in the community.
And Dr. Lauren, you're using some of those, I would imagine, services, right? Like in your school and within your...
To Anthony,
Yeah, to
having
Anthony, I was
mic
about to
issues
say.
today. Absolutely. I've been very fortunate to work closely with Dr. Giles and Dr. Hansinger, for years now. And I would say we frequently send parents and, guardians over to their side of the house for support. So, any of the Carver Cougars out there, definitely if there's a need for support, reach out to me as a principal or our school counseling team. And these fine ladies have been a tremendous, tremendous support for definitely Carver, but the greater community and the entire district. Yeah. But
So we're just about at the end of our discussion and conversation, and these were kind of like pre-populated, questions and all of that. But I always love to end every one of our discussions with just giving each of you some time to kind of, dive into any specific topic that we may not have discussed in depth, or any final thoughts you can leave our families with. Because for me, I want to ask you guys any books that I can even read. You know what I mean? Because I think this is something that goes beyond just parents and students, right? Like, I'm a part of the community here in Chesterfield as well. So if I come in contact with a young man, if I coach baseball or basketball or something like that, having some knowledge of what they may or may not be going through as well can benefit this interaction with this young man or young woman and myself, that can maybe translate to school and to their homes. So if you guys have any books, any resources, or anything, final thoughts you can give our parents here, that would be greatly appreciated.
Well, I know for me personally, I have been involved with ACE Interface. And so Dr. Anda, who is one of the original researchers, has trained cohorts of people in many states across the country to try to bring awareness to the impact of adverse childhood experiences and trauma. And so I believe there are probably 30 trainers now in Virginia. And we do virtual trainings, and those are provided often, so you can look at the Virginia Department of Behavioral Health website and usually find a number of those types of trainings. And the feedback we get from some of that is people who never had any idea of, the impact of this. It's transformative. I mean, I think, in some sense, it creates a lot of empathy and understanding when we are engaging with people who may not behave in ways that we sort of expect. Or maybe we can understand, what creates that elevation with that stress. I think it's personally transformative for people, sometimes thinking into my own history and maybe what's impacted me in my life and how I've responded to that. And so I think that's an opportunity for some really good training that's available. There's certainly a lot of great books. I know one that we started out with in Chesterfield years ago was Help for Billy, which talks about the impact of trauma, and it really gives a lot of good strategies for, working with kids in trauma. Pete Hall and Kristen Sowers have a couple of different books about building resilience, relationship, responsibility, and regulation. I think those are really key concepts. I believe all learning takes place within the context of relationships. So relationships and rapport are just connections for kids are really, really critical to their learning. So those are some of the things that come to my mind. There's a million more, but those are some things that come to my mind.
And to, I guess, add on to what Dr. Hansinger said, Chesterfield Mental Health is currently now providing mental health first aid training for parents and people in the community. So that's definitely a source to where if people want to get familiar with what mental health looks like or look at the characteristics of the different outlines of mental health, that is a great training resource for families and communities as well as students to kind of engage in. I know they have a couple of classes open. I don't have the dates, unfortunately, I'm sorry, but you can definitely call or go on their website and they'll have that information readily available.
A resource that I think I really want to leave people with, some really fantastic work from two colleagues of mine, Dr. Sean Jones, who's also at VCU, and Dr. Brianna Anderson, who is at the University of Michigan. We were talking about mental health earlier, and they have an organization and a series of short videos that you can watch to learn about different aspects of mental health that are particularly culturally relevant for Black and Brown communities, and it's called Our Mental Health Minute, and you can find them, for instance, on Instagram at ROUR. Mental Health Minute is MHM minute. So you can go, and their website, I think, has a number of different resources that families can use. And Dr. Rihanna Anderson in particular has a program and intervention that she does with families to help them talk about issues of race specifically. And so when parents are thinking about that they do need some support or they do need some help in having these difficult conversations, that's a resource to check out.
Yes, I mentioned a couple authors earlier, Jawanza Kunjufu and Christopher Emden. Kunjufu's book, what's the title of that one? Middle class, Black students and middle class teachers. We're also doing a book study at Carver with Christopher Emden. But I think the most important thing for parents to remember is to really show that you're engaged, show that you care about your students and their future. And the best way to do that is to go out and vote. So make sure, I'm not sure if the extent that it's been extended or not, been at work all day. You guys may have reported on it a little bit earlier.
Until Thursday.
Until Thursday. Excellent. Thank you for that update. So yes, registration has been extended through tomorrow for folks to get registered to vote, but show your children that you care by getting out and voting in November. Thank you.
Eye-opening discussion. I came into this honestly thinking that I had a decent grasp of the topic at hand, but it's very evident to me that this is something that goes very deep. And if we can all, as a school district at CCPS, but even more so members of the community, lead with a certain level of empathy, with love, creating healthy spaces for our environments to where our students feel like they can openly discuss how they feel, and then just build on that to make sure that they have a certain stamina to address how they feel when they have these big emotions and they're trying to work through this thing. It seems like once we can equip our students with the tools, they're going to have better outcomes. And I think once that happens, our community has a better outcome. We are ultimately a better society because of it. So I want to thank each and every one of you seriously for taking the time. This was very informative. I thoroughly enjoyed it. I wrote down some of these authors. I hope you at home did the same as well. And I think there's a lot of value that came out of this discussion. So thank you very much. Thank you guys at home for joining us. Have a great night. And we'll do this again. We'll be back here next month with another discussion. Have a good night.